1973. America was drowning in a fuel crisis. People waited in lines for hours, sometimes entire days, just to fill their tanks. Gas prices doubled, then tripled overnight. The entire nation was in panic mode. Cars sat empty in driveways. The American dream of the open road was dying. And right in the middle of all that chaos, one man stood up and said he had the answer. He claimed he'd built a V8 engine. Not some tiny four-cylinder Econobox. A real American V8. And he said it could get 51 miles per gallon. His name was Smokey Yunick. Today, almost 50 years later, people still fight about whether he was telling the truth. The arguments get heated. The accusations fly. Was he a genius who got silenced by an industry that couldn't afford to let him succeed? Or was this the greatest bluff in automotive history? Stay with me, because what you're about to hear might completely change the way you think about engines, oil companies, and what's really possible. Smokey Yunick wasn't just some backyard tinkerer with a wrench and a dream. This was a man who won races at Daytona. A NASCAR legend who built cars that dominated the track. An engineer so clever that racing officials literally had to rewrite the rulebook just to keep up with him. When Smokey walked into a room, other mechanics paid attention. Because if Smokey was working on something, it probably meant he'd found a loophole nobody else had even thought to look for. But in the early 1970s, when the energy crisis hit America like a freight train, Smokey saw something bigger than just winning races. He saw an opportunity to solve a problem that was crippling the entire country. And he started working on something that would either revolutionize the automotive industry forever, or become the most hotly debated hoax in mechanical history. Some people say he cracked the code. That he built an engine so efficient, it threatened billion-dollar industries. That he proved everything we thought we knew about internal combustion was wrong. Others say it was impossible. That the laws of physics simply wouldn't allow what he claimed. That he was a showman selling snake oil to a desperate public. Today, we're going to look at both sides. We're going to dig into the claims, examine the evidence, talk to the believers and the skeptics, and explore the mysteries that still haunt this story half a century later. And by the end, you'll have to decide for yourself. Was Smokey Yunick a suppressed genius whose breakthrough could have changed the world? Or was he the most convincing storyteller the automotive world has ever seen? Let's find out. The crisis. But before we can understand why Smokey's engine mattered so much, you need to understand just how desperate America was in 1973. Because this wasn't just about expensive gas. This was about the American way of life coming to a screeching halt. October 1973. The Yom Kippur War breaks out in the Middle East. Arab nations, furious at American support for Israel, make a decision that will shake the United States to its core. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, announces an oil embargo. No more oil to America. No more oil to any nation that supported Israel. And just like that, the taps shut off. Within weeks, gas stations across America started running dry. Lines formed. People waited for hours. Fights broke out. Some stations started rationing, limiting customers to just a few gallons each. The price of gasoline, which had been hovering around 38 cents a gallon, shot up to 55 cents. Then 70. Then higher. That might not sound like much today, but this was 1973. That was like going from $3 a gallon to $7 overnight. People panicked. President Richard Nixon went on national television and told Americans to turn down their thermostats, carpool to work, and drive slower. He imposed a nationwide 55-mile-per-hour speed limit just to save fuel. It wasn't a suggestion. It was law. And American car companies? They were caught completely flat-footed. For decades, they'd been building bigger and bigger engines. More horsepower, more torque, muscle cars that could smoke their tires and hit 60 miles per hour in under 6 seconds. But fuel efficiency? Nobody cared about that. Gas was cheap. America had plenty of it. Except now, they didn't. And those beautiful V8 engines that powered Mustangs and Camaros and Chevelles and Corvettes? Those things were getting 8 miles per gallon in the city. Maybe 12 on the highway if you drove like your grandmother. Suddenly, that wasn't just inefficient. It was a national security crisis. Detroit scrambled. Engineers worked around the clock trying to figure out how to make their engines sip fuel instead of guzzling it. They tried everything. Smaller carburetors. Leaner fuel mixtures. Catalytic converters. Emission controls. But most of those solutions just made the engines weaker and less reliable. The cars felt sluggish. They stalled. They broke down. American drivers were furious. They wanted their power back. But they also needed to afford to fill their tanks. And that's the world Smokey Yunick was living in when he started thinking about fuel vapor. Down in Daytona Beach, Florida, in a garage that smelled like motor oil, racing fuel, and decades of cigarette smoke, Smokey was doing what he did best. He was questioning everything. See, most engineers at the big car companies were trying to tweak existing technology. Make it a little better. Squeeze out a few more miles per gallon. But Smokey looked at the whole thing and thought, what if we're doing this completely wrong? What if the problem isn't the engine design? What if it's the fuel itself? He said, we're burning fuel the wrong way. We've always been burning it the wrong way. And that statement right there? That's what started everything. Now, to understand what Smokey was talking about, you need to understand how a normal engine actually burns fuel. In a typical internal combustion engine, gasoline gets sucked out of the tank, pushed through the fuel pump, and sprayed into the carburetor or fuel injectors. From there, it gets mixed with air and sprayed into the cylinders as a fine mist. Little droplets of liquid fuel floating in air. Then the spark plug fires and boom! Explosion! That explosion pushes the piston down, turns the crankshaft, and makes the wheel spin. Simple, right? Except here's the problem Smokey identified. When you spray liquid fuel into a cylinder and ignite it, not all of it burns. Some of those droplets are too big. Some don't mix with the air properly. Some just turn into carbon deposits that clog up the engine. So you're wasting fuel. Every single combustion cycle, you're wasting energy. Smokey's idea was this. What if we could turn all the fuel into vapor before it even reaches the cylinder? Not a mist. Not droplets. Pure vapor. If you could do that, and if you could heat that vapor up to the right temperature, you could achieve something called complete combustion. Every molecule of fuel burns. No waste. No carbon buildup. Maximum energy from every drop of gasoline. In theory, that would mean massive gains in fuel efficiency. Now, this wasn't a brand new idea. People had been experimenting with vapor carburetors since the 1930s. Charles Nelson Pogue had a famous design. He got a patent in 1936 for a carburetor that supposedly vaporized fuel and delivered incredible mileage. Some people claimed he got 200 miles per gallon in tests. But the thing is, none of these designs ever made it to production. They either didn't work reliably, or they worked in very specific conditions that couldn't be replicated in real-world driving, or, well, depending on who you ask, they got buried by oil companies. Smokey knew all this history. He'd studied it, but he thought he'd figured out what everyone else had missed. So he grabbed a 1973 Chevrolet Chevelle. It was a mid-size car with a 350 cubic inch V8 engine. 5.7 liters. Nothing exotic. You could buy one at any Chevy dealer. And he started modifying it. First, he wrapped the fuel lines around the exhaust manifold. The idea was to use waste heat from the exhaust to preheat the fuel before it reached the carburetor. Then he completely redesigned the carburetor itself. He turned it into a vaporizing chamber where fuel would be heated to over 200 degrees Fahrenheit. He modified the intake manifold to work as a heat exchanger, keeping that vapor hot all the way until it reached the cylinders. He insulated certain parts. He changed the timing. He adjusted the air-fuel mixture. It took months of trial and error, testing, tweaking, rebuilding. And then, according to Smokey, he took it out on the highway for a real-world test. And something extraordinary happened. The fuel gauge barely moved. He drove, and drove, and drove. When he finally calculated the mileage, the number that came back was 51.2 miles per gallon. From a V8 engine. A real, full-size American V8. In 1973, with gas stations running dry and the whole country desperate for solutions, that wasn't just impressive. That was a miracle. Word started to spread. Smokey wasn't exactly keeping it quiet. He talked to Hot Rod magazine. He gave interviews. He wrote technical articles explaining his concept. And then, according to multiple sources, something even more significant happened. The Environmental Protection Agency showed up at his door. The EPA visit. Now this is where the story gets really interesting. Because what happens next depends entirely on who you ask. According to Smokey, the EPA sent engineers to Daytona Beach to test the hot vapor engine. Federal officials. Test equipment. Clipboards. The works. Smokey said they ran tests. He said the engine performed. He said they confirmed the mileage numbers. But here's the problem. There's no official EPA report that's ever been made public. No press release. No documentation you can look up in a government archive. No paper trail. Just Smokey's word. And the word of a few people who claimed to have been there. Now, the EPA in the 1970s was only a few years old. Founded in 1970. Still figuring out its procedures. Testing one guy's modified Chevelle? That might not have warranted an official report. Or maybe there was a report and it got buried. We don't know. We can't know. But here's what we do know. After 1973, after all the magazine articles and interviews and the supposed EPA visit, nothing happened. The engine didn't go into production. GM didn't license it. Ford didn't replicate it. And Smokey? He didn't push it. Didn't sue anyone. Didn't start a company. He just moved on. And that silence? That's what really fuels the debate. Because if you built something that could get 50 miles per gallon from a V8 in the middle of a fuel crisis, why would you just let it fade away? The believers have an answer. And it's not a comfortable one. They'll tell you the engine was real. That it worked. And they'll tell you it disappeared for one simple reason. It was too dangerous to the people making money. 1973 oil embargo. Gas prices skyrocketing. Oil companies printing money. Exxon, Mobil, Shell, Gulf, billions in profits while Americans struggled to fill their tanks. And here comes this mechanic from Florida saying he can cut fuel consumption by 70%? If that technology gets adopted, oil companies lose billions. Gas stations close. Refineries cut production. The entire petroleum infrastructure starts to crumble. So the believers say they buried it. Not with guns or threats. Just quiet pressure. Money changing hands. Patents tied up in legal battles. Maybe Smokey got a visit. An offer. A warning that his racing career would suffer if he kept pushing. We don't know. But the believers point to a pattern. Tom Ogle, young inventor, early 1980s, built a carburetor system claiming 100 miles per gallon, demonstrated it publicly. Media coverage. Investors interested. Then he died at 26. Official cause? Drug overdose. His family said he didn't use drugs. Said he was excited about production deals. The carburetor design? Vanished. Charles Nelson Pogue. Vaporizing carburetor from 1936. Allegedly 200 miles per gallon. Oil companies reportedly bought the patent. Paid him off. Technology never saw production. Disappeared into history. Stanley Meyer. 1990s. Claimed he invented a car that ran on water. Said he was offered $1 billion to bury it. Refused. 1998. Ran out of a restaurant clutching his throat. Said he was poisoned. His inventions were later debunked in court as fraudulent. But supporters still say he was murdered. Pattern after pattern. Now, you can say these are just conspiracy theories. People die. Inventions fail. And you'd be right to be skeptical. But you can also look at the documented history of the oil industry. Lobbying. Market manipulation. How they fought catalytic converters and unleaded gas. And ask, would they really allow technology that threatens their entire business model to succeed? History suggests probably not. So when people say Smokey's engine got buried, they're looking at decades of patterns. But patterns aren't proof. And there's another side to this story. One that's just as compelling. Because while believers talk conspiracies, engineers talk physics. The physics problem. Because while the believers are talking about conspiracies, the skeptics are talking about thermodynamics. And the thermodynamics are brutal. Engineers and mechanics who actually build engines for a living, a lot of them say Smokey's claims don't just seem unlikely. They say they're physically impossible. At least with the technology available in 1973. Here's the core problem. The more completely you burn fuel, the more heat you generate. That's basic chemistry. Complete combustion releases maximum energy, and that energy manifests as heat. A lot of heat. In a normal engine, some fuel doesn't burn completely. That's actually a cooling mechanism. Those unburned hydrocarbons absorb some of the heat. But if you're achieving near-complete combustion with vaporized fuel, you're generating temperatures that are far higher than what a normal engine experiences. And in 1973, engines were made of cast iron blocks, steel valves, aluminum pistons, and copper head gaskets. Those materials have thermal limits. Push them too far and bad things happen. Cylinder heads warp. Valves burn. Piston rings lose tension. Bearings seize up. One mechanical engineer who studied Smokey's design put it this way. Sure, you might get incredible mileage for a few hundred miles. Maybe even a few thousand. But you're essentially running the engine on the edge of destruction. It's not sustainable. The engine would be toast before you hit 10,000 miles. And here's the thing that really bothers the skeptics. Smokey never claimed the engine lasted. He never said, I drove this car for 50,000 miles and it ran perfectly. He said it got 51 miles per gallon. In a test run. But durability? Longevity? Real-world reliability over years of driving? Silence. And that's a massive red flag. Because an engine that gets amazing mileage but destroys itself after 5,000 miles isn't actually useful. It's a science experiment, not a solution. The other thing that bothers skeptics is the replication problem. Smokey died in 2001. His patents are public record. His concepts have been written about extensively in Hot Rod magazine, in books, in online forums. Thousands of people have tried to recreate the hot vapor engine. YouTube is full of them. DIY mechanics in their garages. Engineering students doing thesis projects. Automotive enthusiasts spending years trying to crack the code. And you know what the results are? Some of them get improved mileage. Maybe they go from 15 miles per gallon to 20. That's a real improvement. But 51 miles per gallon? Consistently? Reliably? Under real-world driving conditions? Nobody's done it. Not one single person has successfully replicated Smokey's claimed results in a way that can be independently verified and repeated. And that raises a very uncomfortable question. If it was real, if it was achievable with 1970s technology and off-the-shelf parts, why can't anyone else make it work? Smokey was brilliant. Absolutely. But he wasn't a wizard. He didn't have access to alien technology or secret materials. He used standard engine parts. Basic thermodynamic principles. Stuff that's been available in every auto parts store for decades. So why, in 50 years of trying, has nobody been able to do what he claimed he did? The skeptics say the answer is obvious, because he never actually did it. At least not the way he claimed. Maybe he got great mileage on a very specific test run. Downhill. Tailwind. Constant speed. Perfect conditions. And he extrapolated that into a general claim that the engine gets 50 miles per gallon. Maybe he got 35 miles per gallon consistently, which was amazing for a V8 in 1973, and he rounded up for effect. Or maybe, and this is the harshest interpretation, he made the whole thing up knowing nobody could really disprove it. And then there's the final red flag. Smokey never released complete blueprints. Never gave step-by-step instructions that someone could follow to build an exact replica. He talked about concepts. He showed pictures in magazines. He gave interviews where he explained the general idea. But a fully documented, engineering-grade set of specifications and measurements that would let someone build an exact copy? Never happened. Why not? If you'd solved one of the biggest problems in automotive history, wouldn't you want to share it? Document it? Make sure it survived even if something happened to you? The believers say he was scared. That he knew what happened to other inventors who pushed too hard. The skeptics say it's because there was nothing to document. Because the claims were exaggerated and he knew a detailed blueprint would expose that. We can't know for sure. But the evidence, or lack thereof, is troubling. The Smokey factor. And here's where the story gets even more complicated. Because there's something about Smokey Yunick that both the believers and the skeptics tend to gloss over. The man was a legendary rule-bender. A certified genius at finding loopholes and exploiting them. In NASCAR, Smokey's cars were famous for being, let's call them creatively legal. There are dozens of stories. Let me tell you one of the most famous. NASCAR officials were getting suspicious of Smokey's cars. They seemed to have more power, better handling, something that gave them an edge. So before a race, they brought one of his cars in for a thorough inspection. They measured the engine displacement. Legal. They checked the carburetor. Legal. They measured the fuel tank capacity. Legal. Everything checked out. They couldn't find anything wrong. So they told Smokey, okay, you passed. But just to be safe, we're going to confiscate your fuel tank. You'll have to install a new one before you can race. Smokey shrugged, said okay, had his crew unbolt the fuel tank and hand it over. And then, he got in the car, started it up, and drove away. He drove it around the infield. Around the parking lot. Ran it for 11 full laps before he finally shut it off. The officials were stunned. How was the car running without a fuel tank? Simple. Smokey had fabricated the fuel line out of 2-inch diameter tubing instead of the normal half-inch line. That giant fuel line held 11 gallons of gasoline. The fuel tank they just confiscated? That was legal. It held exactly the amount it was supposed to. But the fuel line? That was the real tank. Technically, there was no rule against it. NASCAR hadn't thought they needed a rule about fuel line diameter. Until Smokey. After that, they wrote a new rule. Fuel lines could be no larger than a certain size. And that's who Smokey Yunick was. Brilliant, creative, always thinking 3 steps ahead, but also a showman. A guy who understood that perception mattered as much as reality. So here's the uncomfortable question. Did he do the same thing with the hot vapor engine? Maybe it worked. Maybe he really did achieve incredible mileage. But maybe only under very specific, controlled conditions that couldn't be replicated in normal driving. Maybe it was like his oversized fuel line. Technically true, but not quite what people thought it was. Maybe the engine got 50 miles per gallon on a long, flat highway at a constant 55 miles per hour with no stops, no acceleration on a cool day with low humidity. And he presented that as, this engine gets 50 miles per gallon. Not a lie. But not the whole truth either. We see this all the time in automotive testing. Manufacturers test their cars under ideal conditions and then advertise those numbers. Gets 35 miles per gallon. Sure. On a perfectly flat test track, with no wind, driven by a professional who never accelerates hard. In real-world driving, maybe you get 28. Was Smokey doing the same thing? The believers say no. They say he was honest. That the engine really worked the way he claimed. The skeptics say yes, that he cherry-picked his best result and marketed it as typical performance. But here's option 3, and this one doesn't get talked about enough. Maybe Smokey himself didn't fully understand what he'd built. Think about it. Smokey wasn't a trained engineer with a degree in thermodynamics. He was a self-taught mechanic who learned through trial and error. He was brilliant at it. Maybe one of the best who ever lived. But sometimes, when you're experimenting, you stumble onto something that works, and you don't fully understand why. Maybe the hot vapor engine really did get 50 miles per gallon. And maybe Smokey spent the rest of his life trying to figure out exactly what conditions made that happen, and couldn't. Maybe it worked when the ambient temperature was exactly 70 degrees. Or when the fuel had a specific volatility rating that isn't consistent across all gasoline. Or when some combination of factors aligned perfectly. And he could never replicate it. So he had this one incredible result. And he believed in it. He talked about it. He tried to explain it. But he couldn't make it happen again consistently enough to prove it to the world. That would explain a lot. It would explain why he never pushed it to production. Why he never released detailed blueprints. Why he moved on to other projects. Not because he was scared. Not because he was lying. But because he couldn't figure out how to make it work reliably. And if you're Smokey Yunick, a man with a reputation for genius and innovation, admitting that you built something incredible but can't explain it or repeat it, that's hard. Maybe easier to just let it become a legend. Let people debate it. Let the mystery grow. After 1973, Smokey didn't talk about the hot vapor engine nearly as much. He wrote about other things, other projects, other ideas. And when people asked him about it directly, his answers were always vague. It worked. I know it worked. The EPA tested it. You figure out the rest. Never a direct explanation. Never a complete disclosure. Just hints. Suggestions. Pieces of a puzzle he never fully assembled. Maybe because he couldn't. Or maybe because he chose not to. Or maybe because powerful people told him not to. We'll never know. Smokey Yunick died in May of 2001. He was 77 years old. And whatever secrets he had about that engine, he took them with him. So what's the answer? Was Smokey Yunick's 51 mile per gallon V8 engine real? Here's the honest truth. After all the research, all the interviews, all the arguments and debates and conspiracy theories, nobody knows for sure. 50 years have passed. The man's gone. The original Chevelle probably rusted away in some junkyard decades ago. All we have left are stories, claims, memories that might not be reliable, magazine articles that raise more questions than they answer. If it was fake, why did the EPA allegedly test it? Why would Smokey risk his reputation on a lie when he had nothing to gain from it? If it was real, why didn't it survive? Why couldn't anyone replicate it? Why didn't Smokey himself push it to market when the whole country was desperate for solutions? If there was a conspiracy to bury it, why didn't the blueprints ever leak? Why didn't someone, somewhere, blow the whistle with hard evidence? If the physics were impossible, why do credible people still swear they saw it work with their own eyes? Every answer leads to another question. Maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle. Maybe Smokey really did build something special. Something that achieved remarkable efficiency under certain conditions. But maybe the technology of the 1970s wasn't ready for it. Maybe the materials couldn't handle the thermal stress. Maybe the fuel quality wasn't consistent enough. Maybe it worked brilliantly for short periods but couldn't survive long-term use. Or maybe he exaggerated. Maybe he got 35 or 40 miles per gallon, which was incredible for the time, and rounded up to 50 for impact. Or maybe it was real, it worked perfectly, and it got buried by people who had billions of reasons to make it disappear. All of those possibilities exist. And here's what's fascinating. We want to know the answer so badly. This story refuses to die because it taps into something deeper than just engineering curiosity. It's about whether we've been lied to, whether the technology exists to solve our problems but is being kept from us, whether the systems we trust are actually working for us or against us. It's about hope. The hope that maybe, just maybe, there's a simple solution that we're missing. And it's about heroes and villains. Smokey as the genius inventor versus the faceless corporations. David versus Goliath. We love that story. We want it to be true. But wanting something to be true doesn't make it true. Here's what we know for certain. The idea hasn't died. People are still trying. Still experimenting. Still chasing that dream of the ultra-efficient engine. Every few years, someone pops up with a new design. A new modification. A new claim. And every time, the same cycle repeats. Initial excitement. Bold claims. Testing. Skepticism. Debate. And then, nothing definitive. Just more questions. Maybe that's actually the real legacy of Smokey Yunick. Not the engine itself, but the question. The idea that maybe, just maybe, we've been approaching this all wrong. That maybe there's a better way. A simpler way. A way that doesn't require exotic materials or complex electronics or millions of dollars in research. And maybe the only thing stopping us from finding it is ourselves. Our assumptions. Our limitations. Our unwillingness to question the status quo. Or maybe it's just a really good story. A legend from a desperate time when gas was scarce and people needed something to believe in. A tale of a brilliant mechanic who either changed the world or fooled it spectacularly. Either way, it's not going anywhere. This story has survived 50 years. It'll probably survive 50 more. Because as long as we're burning gasoline in engines, as long as we're paying for fuel, as long as we're wondering if there's a better way, people will keep coming back to Smokey Yunick's hot vapor engine. They'll keep asking, was it real? They'll keep arguing in comment sections and forum threads and garage workshops. And maybe that's exactly what Smokey wanted. Not to give us answers, but to make us question everything. To make us think, what if? What if we're wrong about how engines should work? What if the solution is simpler than we think? What if the only thing between us and revolutionary technology is our own willingness to believe it's possible? 50 years after Smokey Yunick claimed he built a V8 that got 50 miles per gallon. We're still asking those questions. Maybe that's the real genius. Not the engine. The question itself. So where do you stand? Do you think Smokey Yunick really built an engine that got 51 miles per gallon? Or do you think it's the greatest myth in automotive history? Or maybe you think the truth is somewhere in between. That something happened that we still don't fully understand. Think about it. Do your own research. Look at the evidence. Read both sides. And then make up your own mind. Because that's what Smokey would have wanted. Not blind belief. Not cynical dismissal. But critical thinking. Questions. Investigation. If this story made you think, if it made you wonder, if it made you want to dig deeper, hit that like button. And if you want more mysteries from automotive history, more stories that don't have clean answers, more legends that refuse to die, subscribe Regal Rides. Because next time, we're diving into another invention that allegedly got buried. One that might be even more controversial than Smokey's engine. Until then, keep questioning. Keep wondering. Keep asking what if. Because the day we stop asking questions is the day we stop finding answers.